Imagine you're a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, and 6 months ago the biggest decision in your life was whether to take the truck or your dad's car to the diner on a Friday night. Now you're crouched in a foxhole somewhere in the hedgerows of France, artillery is thumping in the distance, and someone hands you a small brown cardboard box. Inside is a can of meat, some crackers, a chocolate bar that could probably survive a direct hit, powdered coffee, and a few cigarettes. It's not exactly your mother's cooking, but it's food, it's calories, and it showed up right when you needed it, which is more than can be said for a lot of soldiers on the other side of that same battlefield. The story of how American soldiers stayed fed during World War II isn't really a story about recipes or flavor. It's a story about one of the most astonishing supply operations in human history, one that quietly decided the outcome of battles long before anyone pulled a trigger. Let's start with a basic truth that armies have understood since ancient times, but that World War II proved on an industrial scale. A hungry soldier is a defeated soldier, even if he's still standing. Fatigue sets in, judgment slips, morale collapses, and eventually the body simply stops cooperating no matter how much willpower a man has left. The United States military understood this so deeply that it turned feeding its troops into a science, backed by nutritionists, food chemists, packaging engineers, and an industrial base capable of producing meals by the billions and shipping them to literally every corner of the planet where American troops were fighting. It starts back home, long before any soldier ever sees a ration. American farms, largely untouched by the war itself, kept producing enormous quantities of wheat, corn, meat, and dairy throughout the entire conflict. While European farmland was being churned up by tanks and bombing raids, and while Japan's own agricultural output was strained by manpower shortages as young men were pulled away to fight, American agriculture kept humming along almost as if the war were happening on a different planet. This meant the raw ingredients for feeding millions of soldiers were never really in question. The real challenge wasn't growing the food, it was turning that food into something that could survive a boat ride across the Atlantic, a truck ride through muddy roads, and weeks sitting in a supply depot without spoiling, and then get it into the hands of a soldier who might be eating it standing up in the rain. This is where American food science genuinely shined. The military developed several different ration types, each designed for a specific situation. The C ration was a canned meal meant to be heated when possible, containing things like meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, or corned beef hash, along with crackers, candy, and instant coffee. The K ration was lighter and more compact, originally designed for paratroopers who needed something they could carry easily, and it came divided into breakfast, lunch, and dinner units, each with its own combination of canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes. Then there was the D ration, a dense emergency chocolate bar deliberately engineered to taste mediocre, so that hungry soldiers wouldn't eat it just for pleasure and would save it for genuine emergencies, while still packing enough calories to keep a man moving for a full day if nothing else was available. Soldiers complained about these rations constantly, and honestly, who could blame them? Eating the same canned meat and crackers day after day for weeks on end gets old fast, and plenty of veterans joked for decades afterward about swearing off Spam for the rest of their lives. But complaints about variety miss the bigger picture entirely. The real achievement wasn't flavor, it was reliability. An American soldier on a remote Pacific island or deep in the forests of the Ardennes could reasonably expect that food was going to show up again and again, meal after meal, day after day, because behind him stretched an unbroken chain of factories, canneries, railroads, ships, and trucks all working together to make sure that box of crackers and canned meat kept arriving. Compare this to what German soldiers experienced on the Eastern Front, where supply lines stretched across brutal Russian winters and often simply failed. Troops surrounded at Stalingrad were reduced to eating horses, and eventually nearly starved as the Luftwaffe's attempts to airdrop supplies fell drastically short of what was needed. German quartermasters, despite genuine effort and skill, were fighting a losing battle against distance, weather, and a rail network that couldn't keep pace with how far the army had advanced. Compare it further to Japanese soldiers on islands across the Pacific, where American submarines and aircraft were sinking supply convoys so effectively that troops on places like Guadalcanal were reduced to eating roots, insects, and eventually facing outright starvation. The fighting there became so associated with hunger that Japanese soldiers themselves grimly nicknamed the island, using a word that translated roughly to Starvation Island. These weren't failures of courage or discipline, they were failures of logistics, the same invisible battlefield that decided so much of the war before the shooting even started. The infrastructure behind American food supply was staggering in scope. Canneries across the United States ran around the clock, packing millions of cans of meat, vegetables, and fruit specifically designed for military rations. The packaging itself was engineered to survive rough handling, extreme heat, freezing cold, and long periods without refrigeration, which was no small achievement in an era before modern preservatives and material science had fully matured. These cans and boxes were loaded onto trains, then onto Liberty ships built at record speed in American shipyards, then unloaded at ports in England, North Africa, or various Pacific islands, then trucked or carried by hand the final miles to the actual front line, sometimes under artillery fire, sometimes parachuted in by air when roads were impassable. Behind the front lines, whenever conditions allowed, the Army also ran mobile field kitchens that could prepare hot meals for soldiers pulled back from combat for a rest. These kitchens, mounted on trailers or trucks, could roll close to the action and turn out actual cooked meals, mashed potatoes, roasted meat, fresh bread when flour supplies allowed, giving soldiers a genuine morale boost after days of eating cold rations straight from a can. Coffee, in particular, became almost sacred to American troops, a small taste of normal life delivered in enormous quantities, specifically because military planners understood how much a hot cup of coffee could do for a man's mental state after a sleepless night under artillery fire. It's worth pointing out how much thought went into calorie and nutrient calculations, something that sounds almost bureaucratic until you realize what was actually at stake. Army nutritionists calculated exactly how many calories a soldier needed depending on climate, activity level, and combat intensity, then engineered rations to hit those targets even when fresh food wasn't available, adjusting formulas for jungle heat in the Pacific versus freezing mountain cold in the Ardennes, since a body burning calories to stay warm needs a very different ration than a body sweating through humidity. Vitamin supplements were added to combat deficiencies that had plagued soldiers in previous wars, things like scurvy or beriberi, conditions that had crippled entire armies throughout history simply because nobody understood nutrition well enough to prevent them. American planners, armed with modern nutritional science, refused to let something as preventable as vitamin deficiency weaken their fighting force. The psychological side of food mattered just as much as the physical side. Military planners understood that cigarettes, chocolate, and even chewing gum weren't luxuries. They were tools for managing stress and boredom in an environment defined by both. A soldier who could look forward to a chocolate bar or a smoke after a firefight had one small, dependable comfort in an otherwise chaotic and terrifying situation. This attention to morale through food and small comforts wasn't an accident. It reflected a broader philosophy within American military planning that treated the well-being of individual soldiers as directly connected to combat effectiveness, not as a separate afterthought. No conversation about American wartime food would be complete without mentioning canned meat, and specifically the product that became both a lifeline and a running joke among troops, Spam. Produced by the millions of pounds and shipped everywhere from Europe to the Pacific to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements, Spam became so ubiquitous that soldiers developed an entire subculture of complaints and dark humor around it, inventing nicknames and jokes that survived long after the war ended. But strip away the jokes and what remains is a genuinely impressive feat of food engineering. A canned meat product that didn't require refrigeration, could survive months in transit through brutal heat and cold, and delivered protein and calories to soldiers in places where fresh meat would have spoiled before it ever reached the front. Soviet soldiers who received massive quantities of it through American aid reportedly ate so much of it that some veterans later credited it with helping keep the Red Army fed during some of the most desperate stretches of the Eastern Front, which says something remarkable about how far American food production reached beyond its own troops. The Navy faced its own unique version of this challenge, feeding sailors on ships that might spend weeks or even months at sea without touching land. And submariners in particular presented an extraordinary logistical puzzle. A submarine crew, confined to a steel tube beneath the ocean for extended patrols, needed food that could be stored in incredibly tight spaces without refrigeration for long stretches. Yet somehow the Navy managed to make submarine duty famous for having some of the best food in the entire military, packing boats with canned goods, fresh provisions for the early days of a patrol, and skilled cooks who took genuine pride in turning limited ingredients into meals worth looking forward to, understanding that in the psychologically brutal environment of underwater warfare, a good meal was sometimes the only thing standing between a crew and complete morale collapse. None of this happened by luck. It happened because the United States entered the war with an industrial and agricultural base larger than that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, sitting behind the protective shield of two oceans that meant American farms and factories were never bombed, never occupied, and never disrupted by enemy troops marching through them. While the rest of the industrialized world was fighting a war that ravaged its own farmland and food production, American soldiers were being fed by a country that could produce more food than it even needed, then organized the staggering logistical challenge of shipping a meaningful portion of that abundance to every front line on the planet. On a schedule reliable enough that hungry soldiers could actually plan around it. There's a particularly telling detail from the Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944, when American units at Bastogne found themselves completely surrounded by German forces during one of the coldest winters in memory. Despite being cut off by land, Cargo planes flew through dangerous weather and anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies, food included, so the defenders could keep fighting and keep eating while completely encircled. Compare that to the German forces surrounding them, who were themselves running dangerously low on fuel and food as their own supply lines collapsed under the weight of an offensive that had outpaced what their logistics system could support. Two armies, fighting in the same freezing forest, and one of them had food arriving from the sky while the other was slowly running out of everything. Survivors of Bastogne later described the specific relief of hearing cargo planes overhead, knowing that even completely cut off, hundreds of miles from any port or railhead, someone back home hadn't forgotten them, and that the next ration drop was already on its way regardless of how bad the ground situation looked. By the time the war ended, the numbers behind American food logistics were almost unbelievable. Billions of individual ration units had been produced, packaged, and shipped to combat zones spanning literally the entire globe, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of the Philippines. This wasn't accomplished through any single brilliant invention, but through an enormous coordinated system involving farmers, factory workers, engineers, nutritionists, shipbuilders, and truck drivers, all contributing to one unglamorous but absolutely critical mission, making sure a young soldier far from home never had to fight on an empty stomach. In the end, the story of how American soldiers stayed fed during World War II is really a story about the hidden power of infrastructure and planning. It's easy to focus on tanks, planes, and generals when thinking about how the war was won, but somewhere behind every successful offensive was a much less glamorous chain of canneries, ships, trucks, and mess kitchens working around the clock to make sure food kept arriving. Soldiers may have complained endlessly about canned meat and stale crackers, but that complaint itself was a kind of privilege, a sign that food kept showing up reliably enough to grumble about, while soldiers on the other side of the front lines were sometimes fighting simply to find their next meal at all. That difference, quiet and unglamorous as it was, turned out to be one of the most powerful weapons the United States brought to the entire war. Long after the fighting ended, veterans would gather and swap ration jokes over dinner tables back home, laughing about canned meat and stale biscuits with a kind of fondness that only comes from having survived something together, never quite forgetting that the box of unglamorous food they used to complain about had, in its own quiet way, helped carry them all the way home.